Once upon a time, Lotus wasn't just a team. It was a revolution, a force of nature, a collection of brilliant minds under one mad genius who changed Formula One forever. If Ferrari was the passionate, fiery artist, and McLaren was the cold, calculating scientist, Lotus was the rockstar. They were the ones who took the rulebook and ripped it apart and built something utterly insane from the scraps. At the heart of all of this was Colin Chapman, a man who believed that speed wasn't about brute force, but about intelligence, ingenuity, and an almost pathological obsession with weight saving. He was the man who gave us the monocoque chassis, ground effect aerodynamics, and active suspension. He was the man who turned a small British operation into a powerhouse that took on the giants of Ferrari, McLaren, and Williams, and often even won. But as the saying goes, the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long, and Lotus didn't just burn out, it collapsed in on itself in a slow, miserable descent into irrelevance. You see, by the mid-1990s, the team that had once rewritten the rules of Formula One was nothing more than a tragic relic, limping toward the inevitable. So, what went wrong? How did Lotus go from being the team that defined innovation to a cautionary tale of missed opportunities, financial disasters, and plain bad luck? Well, let's get into it. So, Colin Chapman wasn't just a brilliant engineer, he was a visionary. While Enzo Ferrari believed in making powerful engines and letting everything else come second, Chapman was the complete opposite. He understood that power was pointless without agility, and so he set about designing cars that were as light and aerodynamically efficient as possible. The results were staggering. The Lotus 25, introduced in 1962, was the first Formula One car to use a monocoque chassis, a design principle that every modern Formula One car still follows to this day. The Lotus 49, introduced in 1967, pioneered the idea of the engine as a fully stressed member of the chassis, improving rigidity and reducing weight once again. Then there was the Lotus 72, with its radical wedge-shaped design and side-mounted radiators, and of course, the Lotus 78 and 79, which brought ground effect aerodynamics into the sport, effectively turning the car into a vacuum-sealed rocket ship. The statistics spoke for themselves. Lotus won 7 Constructors' Championships, 6 Driver Championships, and a total of 79 Grand Prix victories. Jim Clark, Emerson Fittipaldi, Mario Andretti, all of them won titles with Lotus, and all of them did so in cars that rewrote what was possible in Formula One. But the problem with being an innovator is that sooner or later the rest of the world catches up, and when Chapman died in 1982, the heart of Lotus went with him. You see, Chapman's death was the equivalent of Ferrari losing Enzo or McLaren losing Ron Dennis. The team was left scrambling, trying to find direction in a sport that was evolving faster than ever. With turbo engines taking over and new regulations constantly shifting the landscape, Lotus needed to adapt, and it struggled. For a brief moment, it looked like they might find their footing again. The team managed to secure Ayrton Senna in 1985, and with him came flashes of brilliance. The Brazilian won his first ever F1 race in a Lotus, and he took multiple victories over his 3-year stint with the team. But even he couldn't stop the decline. Lotus was still capable of designing quick cars, but reliability was a disaster, and without Chapman's visionary leadership, they were now following trends instead of setting them. By 1988, when Senna left for McLaren, Lotus was no longer a title contender. They hadn't won a championship since 1978, and worse still, they had lost their Honda engines, which was a crucial blow in an era where power counted for everything. The late 1980s and early 1990s were nothing short of painful. Without competitive engines and with increasingly poor funding, Lotus found itself slipping down the grid at an alarming rate. In 1989, they switched to Judd V8s, which were about as useful as a chocolate teapot, against the dominant Honda and Renault-powered units. By 1990, they had Lamborghini V12s, which sounded great. but drank fuel like a 12-cylinder black hole, and they barely finished races. Then came the real humiliation. You see, at the 1989 Belgian Grand Prix, Lotus failed to qualify for a race for the first time in their history. A team that once defined Formula One was now struggling to even make it onto the grid. The financial situation was dire. The team manager Peter Waugh was fired. Chairman Fred Bushell was jailed for his involvement in the DeLorean fraud scandal, and the Chapman family, still holding shares in the team, could do little to save it. By 1994, the writing was on the wall. Lotus introduced the 109, a car that was more competitive but still hopelessly underfunded. Johnny Herbert, their lead driver, put in heroic performances, but it wasn't enough. The team limped on until the end of the season before finally closing its doors. Now the Lotus name made a brief return in 2010 under the ownership of Tony Fernandes. However, this wasn't the same Lotus. This was essentially a rebadged new team with no connection to the original squad. Meanwhile, Lotus Cars was sponsoring Renault, leading to a ridiculous situation in 2011 where two teams on the grid were using the Lotus name. The so-called New Lotus under Jenny Capital's ownership did have a minor resurgence with Kimi Räikkönen in 2012 and 2013. The Finn even managed to win a couple of races, and for a brief moment it seemed like the magic was back. But financial trouble soon caught up with him, and by 2015, bailiffs were seizing the equipment in the paddock due to unpaid debts. A team that had once dominated the sport was now having its cars literally taken away before the race weekend. In 2016, Renault took over the team and rebranded it under their own name, ending the last remnants of the Lotus presence in Formula One. But before we end it off, it is important to remember who Lotus really was. Lotus didn't just win races, they changed Formula One forever. The innovations pioneered by Colin Chapman still define the sport today. The monocoque chassis, ground effect aerodynamics, all of it came from Lotus. But Lotus was a team built around a singular genius, and without Chapman, they were lost. Others caught up, finances dwindled, and the magic faded. By the time the final curtain fell in 1994, Lotus was no longer a giant, just a memory of what once was. If there's one lesson to take from the fall of Lotus, it's that in Formula One, brilliance alone isn't enough. You need stability, financial backing, and a plan for the future. Lotus had none of these things after Chapman's death, and in the brutal world of Formula One, that means extinction. But at the end of this video, please let me know what you guys thought of this video, what do you think of the story, and if you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now if you guys did like this one, you must like most of my other stuff, so just go through my channel, see if there's something else I like. I'll check you guys in the next one. Cheers,